Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lou Eisen. This is Ring Talk. And today we are going to discuss the fatal third fight took place March 24th, 1962, at the Mecca of boxing in New York City, Madison Square Garden. And it took place between the defending two-time welterweight champ Benny Kid Paret from Cuba and the challenger and former champion Emile Griffith, who was born in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Benny Kid Paret was born March 14th, 1937, in Santa Clara, Cuba. This fight centers on several factors. It was a very acrimonious, bitter fight. They did not like each other. This was a grudge match, without a doubt. And the grudge started before the second fight at the weigh-in. Um, it was known in boxing circles in the early 60s that Emile Griffith was gay. Wasn't mentioned. The press knew it. You weren't even allowed to write about it. In fact, Pete Hamill told me at the Hall of Fame one year that he almost strangled his editor at his newspaper because he wrote that what had happened, and he said that, which is true, Paret referred to Griffith as being gay, called him a maricon, which is faggot in Spanish. And so when he wrote that down, that he called him a homosexual using a pejorative term, what happened was that Hamill's editor changed it to, he referred to him as an unman, which drove Hamill nuts because he thought, what's an unman? A bread box is an unman. A lamp is an unman, but you weren't allowed to mention it back then. So there were three factors: the homophobic taunting of Griffith by Paret that went way over the line, the fact that Paret, by the time he defended his title for the third time, was a shot fighter and should not have been fighting, and also why Hall of Fame referee, one of the best ever, Ruby Goldstein, just stood there. He froze as Griffith in the 12th round landed just under 30 consecutive headshots. After the first 3-4 headshots, Paret was gone. His arms were by his side. He wasn't defending himself. He was just a punching bag. And Goldstein froze. Only time it ever happened to him in his career. And he retired after that. He never refereed another bout. Paret grew up in Cuba. He was born in Santa Clara. And he loved the fight. And I explain it this way: most kids, most people, but especially young boys at, between 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, they don't fight unless they're cornered. They just won't. It's a natural instinct. Paret loved to fight. He lived to fight. He would go around picking on bigger guys just so he could fight. And he loved to test himself against other people. So Paret would fight all the time. And he got into the amateurs and he did well. And people loved him. And his style didn't really change from the amateurs to the pros. Paret was a walk-in face-first slugger. And that's why fans loved him, because he guaranteed action. His hero was the great Kid Gavilan. And Gavilan was a tremendous fighter, an exciting fighter. Gavilan understood, like Ali after him, that you have to put on a show. As we saw last night, it wasn't such a great fight with Tyson Fury and Dillian White, but it's sports, but it's also entertainment. And Gavilan understood that. And he was Paret's, hello, Sheila from Atlanta. Thank you for joining us. He was Paret's hero. The thing is, there's a great difference between the two men, which is, as brilliant as Gavilan was offensively, he was equally masterful on the defense. He was a hard guy to hit. Remember, he came within a few points of beating the great Sugar Ray Robinson. Paret had no defense. Paret, the fighter that you would compare him to, a modern fighter from the last 20, 30 years, would be Arturo Gatti. Now, before people get up in arms, Gatti was a very good technical fighter. He just eschewed that later in his career for becoming a power puncher. And it comes down to one immutable fact: asses in the seats. The more people you can fill the arena with, the more money you can demand. And knockout artists will always get paid more. And with the exception, of course, of Muhammad Ali. So Paret is doing well in the amateurs. He's knocking people out. The problem with his style is it has a short shelf life. The body can only take a certain finite amount of punishment, and then after that, the person's body will start to break down. And that's what happened to Paret, although I'm getting ahead of myself here in the long run during his professional career. He was spotted after he'd moved from Santa Clara to Havana. And he was then managed by Manuel Alfaro, who's a rather shady character in boxing history. So Alfaro started to manage him, and Paret had his first 25 fights in Cuba, of which he won 24. Paret had a major problem with Alfaro as his manager, which was Benny Kid Paret was illiterate, couldn't read or write in Spanish or English, couldn't count. So he was at the mercy of Alfaro. And the problem with that, of course, is you could give him a number that he was going to get paid for his fight, or you could tell him the percentage that Alfaro would get from his purse, but it meant nothing to him because he was illiterate. And he rarely got paid whatever he was promised. After he has his first 25 fights in Cuba, Alfaro, who was mob connected, uses his New York mob connections to Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo, the Lucchese family, moves Paret to New York, and Paret starts to zoom up the welterweight rankings. Now, Paret was good. He was winning. The fights weren't fixed. Paret was getting his opportunity, and he was beating guys consistently. At that time, Emile Griffith had taken a circuitous route to getting into professional boxing. What had happened with Emile was he followed his father and eventually the rest of his family to the United States. His favorite sport was baseball. That's the one he wanted to be a professional in. But he needed a job to support himself. So he got a job in a woman's hat store in Millinery owned by Howie Albert. Howie Albert was the business partner of one of the all-time greatest trainers, Gil Clancy. Howie managed the business end of boxing, and Gil trained them. And one day, while he's working in the back of the hat factory making these hats in the late 50s, it's a brutally hot, and I've been to New York, and if you've been there, you know how hot it gets. There's stifling hot day. Windows are open, but there's no air conditioning. He's pouring sweat, and he asks Howie Albert, this is the story they gave, if he could take his shirt off, and he did, and he couldn't believe the musculature, the physique that Griffith had. So he said, you should try boxing, at which point Griffith said, why would I do that? I don't like being hit, and I don't like hitting other people. But he got him to the gym. He was a quick learner. He was an all-around athlete, and in no time, he was doing well in the amateurs. And he'd moved up very quickly in the amateurs, at which point he said to Gil Clancy, which was true, I come from a very large family. I have a lot of siblings. I have to make money to support them. I have to help out. So he turned pro. And with Griffith had his first pro fight was June 2nd, 1958. It was a 4-round win over Joe Parnham at St. Nicholas Arena, which is where Benny Kid Paret fought all the time too. And so Griffith starts to do well. He starts to move up in the rankings. Both men are doing well. And Paret is the first one to get a shot at the world welterweight title, and he wins it by defeating, in 1960, he defeats Don Jordan for the title by unanimous decision. I believe it was at the Las Vegas Convention Center. So he defeats Don Jordan, and the problem, and I'm going to refer to my notes here, the problem for Paret and many fighters that die, the reason that these fighters die, obviously from severe brain trauma, but it's from having too many fights over too short a period of time. And you have to see this. He wins the title May 27th, 1960. 2 months later, he fights Garnett Hart. 1 month after that, he fights Danny Moyer, who was a great fighter. Then he fights the ultra-tough Luis Frederico Thompson 4 months later. 2 months after that, he fights Gaspar Ortega. And if the name sounds familiar, it should. Ortega's son, Mike, is one of the top referees in the sport today and a great guy. So he fights Ortega. 2 months after that, he fights Emile Griffith, 1961, April 1st at Miami Beach. And the three fights between Griffith and Paret took on a similar pattern. What happened was, in each of their fights, Paret's doing well at the beginning. He's walking in and he's, hell-bent for leather. Griffith is trying to fight Paret on the outside. And for some reason, and it happens with fighters, it happens with all people, Griffith loses focus during the fight and he starts to sleepwalk through the fight. And after about 4 or 5 rounds, Gil Clancy gets in his face and said, listen, you're not the only contender for the welterweight title. The division's stacked. You lose. There's no reason for him to give you another fight. You're done. You're 22. You're done. It will be over. And so Griffith turns up the heat, starts battering Paret around the ring, and in the 13th round, catches him with a left hook, drives him back in the ropes, hits him again and again and again. Paret drops to the canvas. He is out cold. Referee counts 10, and then Paret's cornermen have to lift him and carry him to the corner. And Griffith wins the title. And right after Griffith wins the title, he has a couple of fights, and then he fights Paret again. And their second fight, September 30th, 1961. And he loses that fight by split decision. Now, I have to mention, there were about 20 sports writers there, ringside. 16 of them picked Griffith. Now, a lot of times when you watch a fight, when the fight's over, you look at how the fighters look, how badly their faces are beaten up. And the age-old question of boxing is, well, who would you rather be? Well, after the fight, Griffith's face was pristine. There were no marks. Paret's eyes both were literally swelled shut, and he had a huge cut under his left eye. He was leaking blood from his mouth and his nose. And yet, he was given the decision, and he won back his title. Now, the thing here is, he didn't take time off after that. He wins back the title, and he's fighting again. He's fighting 2 months later, and then a month after that, and then a month after that, and a couple months after that. He keeps fighting. There was no time off ever for Paret to allow his body to heal. And it was detrimental to him in the long run, but of course, during his career, because a fighter can only take so much punishment before their body and mind gives out completely. So after the second fight, or after the first fight, they as I said, they have the second fight. Paret wins it back, and Paret has a couple of fights. And what does Paret do at that point in time? He does something amazing, which he should not have done, which may have cost him his life. He challenges the great Gene Fulmer, who was built like a Sherman tank, a middleweight, the undisputed world middleweight champion who'd beaten Ray Robinson and who could punch like a heavyweight. He challenges him for the middleweight title, only a couple months after winning his title back from Griffith. And he takes a tremendous pounding. He's sort of competitive in the first 3-4 rounds because of his hand speed, but he's not boxing Fulmer. He's standing toe-to-toe. He's squaring up and slugging it out with Fulmer. And that's what Gene Fulmer wanted him to do. And, as the great Charlie Goldman said, you don't fight the other guy's fight. No one ever invented a game just to be beaten at their own game. It doesn't work that way. You have to use guile and cunning. And Paret didn't have that in the ring. He just had his power. And over the course of the fight, Fulmer just gave him a phenomenal beating, just pounded him down, knocked him down repeatedly, and then knocked him out in the 10th round. And it was a severe beating. Now, here's an interesting thing. Fulmer won the fight, but didn't fight again for a year. That's how vicious the fight was. And he said, I never hit a man harder and more often than I hit Benny Paret. I hit him sledgehammer blows. And what happens after the fight? He's fighting just over 3 months later for the third time against Griffith, defending his title. And that should not have happened. His manager, Manuel Alfaro, let it happen. The New York State Athletic Commission let it happen. People should have seen the beating he took. They did, But they did nothing about it. They let him keep fighting. And that was wrong. He should have taken time off after the Fulmer fight to allow his body to recover and should have had a full physical. In fact, after the Fulmer fight and right up to the night before the third Griffith fight, he complained to his wife, Lucy, that he was having nosebleeds, ear bleeds, his eyes hurt, the back of his head was throbbing, his trouble with his vision. And these were all indications that he had brain trauma, but no one did anything about it. Now, in deference to the New York State Athletic Commission, they didn't know about it. So people will say, well, how come he went for the examination and they did nothing? Because Paret said he felt great, never told them he had a problem. I mean, neither did his manager. Why didn't his manager, Emile Griffith, send him to see a neurosurgeon? Send him to the doctor, send him to the hospital. Why? Well, because if he had done that and the news leaked out, the fight would have been stopped. They wouldn't have allowed the third fight. They would have suspended Paret, if not for 6 months, they would have suspended him permanently. They would have taken away his boxing license. So Paret had no choice but to keep fighting. And as his wife Lucy said, he was illiterate. He couldn't read or write, couldn't count. What else was he going to do but fight? He had no choice but to fight. And so Paret, just over 3 months after taking a ferocious beating from Fulmer, had to step into the Madison Square Garden ring and take on Emile Griffith, who was probably the best fighter in the world at that point, pound for pound. So that was one of the controversies. Paret fought too often in too short a time span. And his manager wanted him to keep fighting to make the money. And the other thing, of course, was he never got the money he was promised. He was always given a little bit of money, but never the full extent of what he had signed for. He put an X for his name. As I said, to be with a wolf like Alfaro and his mob contacts counted against Paret because Alfaro was going to keep him fighting forever. So before the second fight, they had a weigh-in. New York State Athletic Commission has to weigh in. The press is there. They had a weigh-in before all their fights, like you do today. But it was a casual weigh-in before the first fight. They were kind of friends. They were more acquaintances. Paret and Griffith lived in the same neighborhood in New York. They shot basketball together. If they bumped into each other on the street, do you want to go for coffee? Sure. So, they got along. For the second fight, in front of the press, is when Paret started to call Griffith a medicon, which is Spanish for faggot. He kept referring to him that way. I'm going to beat you up, and then I'm going to beat up your husband. He kept saying to him. In fact, Griffith was bisexual. He was actually married at one point and had a daughter. But this was not only jumping over the line, this was taking a running start to jump over the line. No one discussed those things back then. Never got into the press. The media knew about it, but they shut up. A lot of the media, especially the older white conservative media who knew Joe Louis and covered Joe Louis, didn't approve of this, but what were they going to do? Plus, Griffith wasn't the first gay champion. Panama Al Brown, who was the world bantamweight champion in the 1920s, was a homosexual, and everyone knew it, but no one mentioned it. The problem is, back in that time, in 1962, homosexuality, unbelievably, was banned everywhere in the United States, I believe, except Illinois. So, as crazy as that sounds, that was the state of affairs. Why did Paret call him Americone? Well, Paret was born in Cuba, raised in the era of machismo, and thought being a boxing champion meant you were the most macho of all men. You accepted your injuries, you kept fighting, you didn't complain, you just shut up and did your job. And so for a person like him who was steeped in machismo, a person who was homosexual or bisexual to Paret would be beneath him. That's just my theory. And so he kept teasing him. Even after Gil Clancy had said to Manuel Alfaro, the trainer of Paret, that's over the line. We don't do that. And Angela Dundee, in talking about the fight, said to me, the thing is, you don't want to give, you don't make it personal when you trash talk. You don't want to give the guy you're fighting extra motivation to bash your face in. But that's what Paret was doing. Griffith was furious. He wanted to strangle Paret. But Gil Clancy had a hold of him, took him away. They had the fight. And although I think Griffith won, Paret gets the decision. Before the third fight, what I'm about to tell you is mind-boggling. The New York State Athletic Commission knew that these two guys did not like each other. And they could have had them weigh in at separate venues, which would have been the smart thing to do. They didn't. So at the weigh-in before the third fight, in front of the full media, they stripped down to their underwear, like fighters do today, and Griffith gets on the scale. And he's on the scale, and he's looking at the weight, and Paret, who's standing near him in his underwear, before anyone realized what had happened, Paret slipped in behind Griffith, grabbed his derriere, and simulated sodomizing him. People said they could literally see smoke coming out of Griffith's ears. Griffith whirled around, looked at him and said, "Tonight, I'm going to kill you. Tonight, I'm going to take your life for that." Gil Clancy grabbed him and said, No, we don't fight now. We fight in the ring for money. Now, Griffith didn't mean that. He didn't want to kill him or kill anyone. But in the heat of the moment, he'd been violated in a horrific fashion, and that was his response. And so that set the acrimonious tone. The problem with that, of course, aside from being that it's so egregious and so homophobic, is that Paret's corner laughed. They thought it was funny. It didn't occur to them they were the only ones laughing. No one else was laughing. The press stood there with their mouths open. They were shocked. They were just stunned. They couldn't believe what they had just seen. And so that was the stage. This is what had happened before their third fight. So they go to the ring that night. Both of them are bristling with kinetic energy. And they're dancing up and down in the dressing rooms. They can't wait to get to the ring and get at each other. So they're making their way, their ring entrance. And once they get into the ring, Emile Griffith had a very unusual mental makeup for a prize fighter. Griffith was a super sensitive person who cared deeply for other people. When I met him and he asked about my parents, he said, "Well, your mother must be proud." And I said, I didn't really know my mother that well because I was 5 when she died and she was just 34. She died of cancer. And I'd never met him before, but he started to cry convulsively. Put his hand on my shoulder. "That's so terrible. That's not right." I mean, that's how he felt. He was a deeply sensitive person. He saw no reason why Paret should make it personal. In his mind, they'd been friends. This was just business. But now it was more than business, because now they weren't just fighting to see who was the better man. In the minds of everyone who was there, including the fighters, they were fighting to see who was more of a man. So they get in the ring, and the referee is Hall of Fame referee Ruby Goldstein, who'd been a great fighter himself in the 20s. They called him the Paderewski with mitts. The only problem Goldstein had was he had no chin. But he was a great referee. And so the fight begins, and it followed the pattern of their previous 2 fights. Paret's doing well in the beginning, and for some reason, Emile Griffith is once again sleepwalking through the fight. And near the end of the 6th round, he catches Griffith with a beautiful shot, and Griffith goes down on his back. Gets up, takes an 8 count. And before Paret can follow up his advantage, the bell rings. And he goes back to the corner, and Gil Clancy says to him, "You lose here, and that's it. I mean, you're sleepwalking through the fight. Should I stop it now? If you really want to win, you got to show me something this round, or I'll stop it. Get out there and punch, and don't stop punching until either he goes down or the referee stops it. So the bell rings for round 7. Excuse me. The bell rings for round 7. Griffith is a changed man. He comes out, and now he's getting in close, and he's letting his hands go, and he's digging these vicious shots, booming left hooks to Paret's liver, and they're starting to have a real bad effect on Paret. Paret, who liked to walk in and slug, realizes he can't do that now against Griffith. But his body's been so ravaged by Griffith's body shots, and he's starting to get tagged frequently with a sickening regularity to the head, and his head keeps snapping back violently all the time, that he has no choice but to lean up against the ropes and just square up against Griffith. And at that stage of the fight, that was exactly the wrong thing to do. And Griffith, round after round, keeps hammering him. And this is one of the ironic points in boxing. Paret was only 25. He was a young man, but he was an old boxer. He had a lot of wear and tear on his body. And the fact that he was fighting Griffith just over 3 months after taking the worst beating that a fighter had taken in many years from Gene Fulmer was ridiculous. And he had complained of these problems, the nosebleed, the ear bleed, double vision, phenomenal headaches, right up until the night before the fight. So as the fight progresses from round 7 on, Griffith is just teeing up on him. He's landing shot after shot after shot. And then we come to the fatal 12th round, where he catches Griffith with a couple of shots. Griffith staggers back into the ropes. Paret staggers back into the ropes. And as Paret staggers back into the ropes, Griffith lands 4 quick shots. Bang, 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 bang. Left, right, left, right. At that point, Paret's arms go down. He's no longer able to defend himself. After his arms go down, Griffith still lands another 26 consecutive headshots. Referee Ruby Goldstein it's almost like watching Wile E. Coyote in a Looney Tunes cartoon. When they show it in slow motion. He's frozen. He's leaning forward, but nothing's happening. And people are saying, "What's he waiting for? What are you doing? He's killing him." And finally, he comes to his senses. Goldstein jumps in, grabs Griffith, at which point Paret sickeningly slides down unconsciously down the ropes with his arm caught over the ropes, and he slides into the canvas like he's sliding into a coffin. And Griffith goes over and starts to celebrate, and then he tones, because Gil Clancy tells him to tone it down. And he keeps saying to Gil Clancy, Griffith says, "Well, Benny will get up, right?" And Gil Clancy says, "I hope so." "Well, Benny will get up, won't he?" "Hopefully. But Benny's going to get up." "Well, we hope he's going to get up." He doesn't get up. He's out cold. He's not moving. Doctors get in the ring, and they're trying frantically to find a pulse. They're trying to get him, to see how his breathing is. There's no response. So they have to stretch him out of the ring, and they take him to Roosevelt Hospital. Now, what happened there at the hospital was you have a Dr. Halpern and several other neurosurgeons, and this was common back then. There was no CAT scans or MRIs. It didn't exist back then. That was technology in the future. They drilled 4 holes, 2 on each side of his head, to allow room for his brain, because his brain was swelling. And he remained in a coma for 10 days, and he died without regaining consciousness on April 3rd. When they did the autopsy, Dr. Halpern said he didn't suffer from injuries from previous fights. We saw no evidence of that. However, I took the autopsy report and sent it to my kid brother, who's a doctor, and he said, well, that's not exactly true, because at the time they examined his brain was so swollen, they wouldn't have been able to see other edemas or hematomas that he had suffered, especially in his fight with Fulmer. So people like to ask, well, if he hadn't fought Fulmer, would he still have died in the Griffith fight? We don't know. What if he fought Fulmer but fought someone else other than Griffith? Would he still have died? Probably. Fulmer was the coup de grace to Paret's life. Griffith finished the job. He didn't finish it in the 12th round when the fight ended. Probably in the first couple rounds when he hit him, Paret was starting to go downhill. Paret had an inordinate amount of fights in such a condensed time period that it was too much. And his style, which is limiting at best, fatal at worst, put his health at risk. As I said before, he had no defensive skills, whatever. Before the fight, my mentor, Angelo Dundee, had said to him, listen, to Alfaro, his trainer and manager, he shouldn't be fighting. His reflexes are shot. And Alfaro said, well, if something goes wrong, I'll just go to Cuba and get another boy. After the fight, he got paid 40 grand for that fight. The widow said, his widow Lucy said, there was no money. It was gone. Now I heard rumors that Frank Costello took it. I never was able to verify that. His widow said that Manuel Alfaro, his manager, absconded with the money. And that would not have been uncommon. That happened to a lot of fighters back then. What was amazing about Griffith, of course, was after this fight, it sort of destroyed, it just vanquished part of his soul. He was never the same again. Part of Griffith died in the ring that night with Paret. He never got over it till his dying day. And the amazing thing about Griffith was he still fought 78 more times, but he never quite had the killer instinct. He scored some knockouts after that, and he won the welterweight title. He lost it to Luis Rodriguez, and then won it again, and then he won the world middleweight title. But he was never the same. And if you watch the video Ring of Fire, there's a really heartwarming time when he embraces Paret's son. And the son said, I don't hold you responsible for what happened. And Griffith starts to cry, of course. He never meant to hurt him. He didn't want to take his life. He fought a man that had nothing left to give, a man who should not have been allowed to defend his title again. But of course, the humane thing to do would have been for the New York State Athletic Commission, and Gene Fulmer said this, to give him a thorough brain exam or to suspend him for a year or to take away his license for good. But as Gene Fulmer also said, when it comes to boxing, humanity and boxing seldom ever mix. So that's the story of the fight. It goes down as one of the most tragic fights in the history of the sport. It was also the first, at that point in time, of three fighters who died within a year or so of each other. The next one died was the featherweight champion, Davey the Springfield Rifle Moore, and then heavyweight Alexander Laveranti, who was fatally injured just after that, was in a coma for 3 years, and then passed away. But I asked people to go and look up the fights of Benny Kid Paret. He truly was a great fighter. He was only 25 when he died. Emile Griffith lived to July 22nd, 2013, and he was 75 years old when he died. I met him many times. He was a wonderful man. He was the victim of a gay bashing just before he died. He was a gentle, kind, generous person who was so nice to everyone that he met. And his disposition, you looked at someone that sweet and you thought, this is the wrong guy to be in the sport of boxing. But that's where his talents were. That's how brilliant he was in the ring. And the fights with Paret are the ones that people, of course, will remember forever. They're three great fights. And both men Both men deserve to be remembered forever. And if you have a chance, please, just before I go here, if you have a chance, please go to YouTube and watch all of their fights. These are two great fighters who raised boxing to the level of an art form. And Griffith is deservedly in the International Boxing Hall of Fame. I'm Lou Eisen. That's been Ring Talk for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will see you again soon.